Well, welcome to this Expert Voices seminar on respect orders and tackling antisocial behaviour. My name is Phil Bowen. I'm Director of the Centre for Justice Innovation. For those of you who don't know us, the Centre for Justice Innovation is a not-for-profit organisation that seeks to build a justice system which every citizen believes is fair and effective. We do that by delivering a range of work, including hands-on sort of practice support to practitioners. We conduct research into how things work right now and how they could work better in the future. And we try to promote evidence-based and innovative justice policy reform. So this Expert Voices seminar series is at the heart of the approach that the Centre has, bringing together experts to discuss, debate prominent issues in our justice systems. We work across criminal and family justice with aspirations to work more in the civil justice space as well. So it's quite timely that we come to this event about antisocial behaviour. For those who are interested, we've hosted similar sessions, expert voice events on things like trauma-informed practice, on justice and the spending review, and in March we'll be hosting a discussion about the court's response to violence against women and girls, which is obviously one of the government's core missions, where we'll hear from national and international experts. All of our expert voice seminars are available to watch on our YouTube channel. I'm sure we'll include the link to the to them in our Q&A section. So just for today, we're focused on tackling antisocial behaviour and discussing the potential of the government's manifesto commitment to introduce what they call new respect orders. And I'm delighted to say that we've got a really excellent panel to discuss these issues with. We have John Mallows, Chief Inspector in South Yorkshire Police and the Force Lead in South Yorkshire for Antisocial Behaviour. He first joined the force in 2000, and he'll be talking about his experience of policing and the use of ASB powers and thoughts on the use of potential use of respect orders. We have Andrea Fraser, civil justice lawyer at the Civil Liberties charity Justice. She worked on their behaviour control order report, which I'd highly recommend. And again, we can put that in the chat. And she will just be discussing the issues she sees with both current ASB powers and her hopes / fears for the new respect orders. And then I'm delighted to say we've also got Anna Coffey, who's the co-CEO of High Trees, a community centre which is actually just down the road from me in South London, discussing community responses to ASB, including prevention, investing in communities, provision of youth services. So I think three really excellent speakers. We'll hear from each speaker in turn. I'll give them about 10 minutes, and I will try and keep them to their 10 minutes if I can be so disciplined. I'll then ask them some initial questions, but do feel free for those members of you in the audience, as the speakers talk, please free to pop any questions that you have as they arise in the Q&A function, which we'll moderate, and then I'll try and go through as many of those questions in the hour that we have. So I hope that's all clear. Before turning over to the panel to speak, I did want to sort of briefly set a bit of the context. So just in terms of what we're talking about, antisocial behaviour. So the 2014 Anti-Social Behaviour Crime and Policing Act provides a legal definition of ASB in England and Wales, describing it as conduct that has caused or is likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress to any person. Home Office guidance offers examples of that type of behaviour: threatening or harassing behaviour, drug use, vandalism, disruptive neighbours, playing loud music. Obviously, ASB can be really impact individuals and communities in all sorts of different ways. There are two main ways that we measure the scale of antisocial behaviour in the country. Obviously, firstly, data collected by police forces on ASB incidents. And then there's the crime survey for England and Wales, which provides information about people's perceptions of ASB. And we see sort of two interestingly slightly contradictory trends. The police data seems to suggest that the levels of ASB have been on a slow downward trend in recent years, from over 2 million incidents in 2014 to just 1 million last year. Crime survey suggests that actually people's perceptions of ASB have remained actually relatively static over the last 10 years, with about a quarter of the public in each of the years in the last 10 perceiving ASB as a significant or very significant issue in their local area. So ASB is clearly a phenomenon and something that the system needs a response to, which brings us to kind of, and I would try and keep this very summary, the powers that we use to deal with ASB. So back in 1996, the Housing Act empowered local authorities to address housing-related ASB. There was then the election of the old New Labour government in 1997, who introduced a range of powers to reduce ASB, including probably the most famous power, the Anti-Social Behaviour Order, or ASBO, which allowed police, local councils and others to apply to magistrates' courts acting in their civil capacity to grant an order that could prohibit any person aged over 10, 10 or over, I should say, prohibit them from engaging in antisocial acts, breach of which could be prosecuted by, for adults, up to a maximum penalty of 5 years. So it was a civil order, but it had criminal implications if breached. Again, to try and be very summary about this, in 2010, with the election of the coalition government, they announced a review of ASB policy. That culminated in the 2014 Act that I mentioned a bit prior, which tried to streamline existing ASB powers into just a few, most notably the Anti-Social Behaviour Injunction, or the ASB, a civil injunction obtained by police and others that could prohibit any person aged over 10 from engaging in ASB. We've got the Criminal Behaviour Order, similar to the ASBI, that can be imposed following any conviction, the Public Spaces Protection Order. So there is a range of existing powers to deal with ASB, but as part of the newly elected New Labour government, they made a manifesto commitment to take back our streets, and as part of that have proposed new respect orders, which are intended, we gather, to partially replace the function of existing civil injunctions and CBOs. So at this really interesting point in the new government where the kind of policy, legal and political worlds are coming together, and we therefore felt it was really timely to discuss how current powers are working, what the potential is for this new power with yourselves, practitioners, policymakers and others, about how we tackle ASB. So that's kind of why we decided to bring this all together right now, because we think it's kind of timely before bills go through Parliament that we have a real understanding of the issues. So as I said before, as the speakers talk, please feel to pop any questions that arise into the Q&A function, but I'll now hand over to the panel, the real experts, to talk about this, starting with John for his reflections.
Thanks very much, Phil. Firstly, thank you for the invite. Obviously, I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint to materialise. That's great. Thanks very much, Amanda. So thank you to the Centre for the invitation. And can I just say congratulations on all the work you do as well, which is, there's some fantastic research that takes place. I think it'll be clear to the audience from the outset when I speak, I certainly am not an academic in any shape or form. I very much approach this presentation from a practitioner's perspective, through the lens of working in neighbourhood policing and addressing or trying to tackle ASB, but also probably more crucially, I'm the thematic lead for ASB currently for South Yorkshire Police. So that's how I'll take this presentation forward. Miranda, could I just go to the next slide for me, please? Thanks very much. So I thought it would be really useful just to outline actually what does a thematic lead for ASB do. It's certainly, there's no APP or authorised professional practice sitting behind it. It's something I do both the day job and other responsibilities I have in the force. But what I would say from the outset, I'm really proud to perform the role to try to make a difference to victims of ASB here in South Yorkshire. But the role itself is very much centred around the construction of strategies and policies, just ensuring we're compliant with statutory guidelines, promoting innovation, crucially, and this is really important to my philosophy, evidence-based practices across the organisation, but also the wider community partnerships. And I think really relevant to the theme of this event is how we use a range of interventions and orders available to us via the ASB Act of 2014, and that ranges from community protection notices to criminal behaviour orders, public space protection orders, which Phil made reference to, and really trying to identify the best practice and how we use that, the governance around it, the training to give staff the confidence to use those powers, but also a degree of proportionality as well. These are intrusive powers, and based on the framework through various theoretical frameworks, they have to be applied in a proportionate manner. And it's really, really interesting. I think from 2026, we're going to have to, as forces, submit data returns to the Home Office as a mandatory process and how we're using these powers available to us. I put a strapline on the slide here around culture eats strategy, which is a very famous business quote. I've missed the breakfast element out of it, so we don't get hungry. So you can have all the strategies and policies in place, but if your operational and whole system response is not fit for purpose, I think those strategies and policies are meaningless. So again, part of my role as the thematic lead is to ensure that we're implementing those strategies and policies from a cultural perspective. And Miranda, if you just move to the next slide, I'm just going to give you an example of how I think that culture has changed around ASB operational practice. In 2023, South Yorkshire Police was selected as one of 10 locations to pilot ASB patrols in high demand locations. So through the National ASB Action Plan, we received about £2 million over 2 years. And that's allowed us to take or embark on 10,000 additional patrol hours in our high demand locations. And through those hotspot patrols, which is based on copper curve methodology, we remain in the areas for 15, 20 minutes, and then we move on to the next location. We've seen a sustained reduction of about 28% in those ASB locations. And I very much describe this as a legacy project because we've been able to invest through the funds we've received on equipment to make a difference to new forms of ASB which have emerged. So we've been able to purchase quad bikes, drones to address, for example, the issue around off-road bikes. And my first observation and reflection for this presentation is, I think sometimes ASB is very much focused on urban, town and city environments, but there's a lot of ASB which occurs in rural, semi-rural locations, and we have a responsibility to serve those communities as well. And I think projects like this enables us to do that. And just an observation around the ASB Action Plan, I think that's been the most significant policy and operational matter or development since the 2014 Act came in place. Whatever the government's intentions or political intentions at that time, what it's allowed us to have is to focus time, resources and investment in making a difference to our communities. Miranda, could you just go to the next slide for me, please? Thanks very much. So this next slide is, I suppose, a blancmange of reflections of an ASB from my perspective. I think it's really important to have a clear philosophy and approach to addressing ASB, be that public health approach, a trauma-based approach, and I highly recommend the previous event at the centre run around trauma-based interventions. It was really, really informative from my perspective. I think here in South Yorkshire Police, we very much have a problem-oriented policing approach based on the Goldstein principles, using the SARA approach. So we have over 40 problem-oriented policing plans in place, which allow us to address ASB in a complex way. But I think it's also important to look at other philosophies. So, for example, I'm looking very much at a trauma-based approach to how we identify victims of ASB, particularly repeat victims of ASB, and also those who are vulnerable. And I think there's some really interesting research which has come out from Sheffield Hallam University, led by Dr. Vicky Heap, who looked at the cumulative impact of ASB on victims. And through Vicky's research in 2021, she's made some subcategories of behaviour types, including fear, stress, avoidance behaviours, impact on sleep patterns, mental health, and anxiety. And we're trying to hopefully incorporate that into our new risk and vulnerability assessments for repeat victims of ASB, and hopefully using some AI technology to further that in terms of advancements of using data and the technology which is obviously emerging from the environment. So, but that's still very much early work for ourselves. I've mentioned about giving officers confidence to use the powers. Again, I think that's crucial. Again, another observation for myself, and obviously we'll be moving on talking about respect orders. I suppose an observation for myself would be, have we truly evaluated the 2014 Act? Is it still fit for purpose? Is there some additionality which needs to be added, or is there still a range of tools that we have yet to explore, particularly from a community safety policing perspective, that still remain undiscovered, or we can use more effectively? So I still think there's some evaluation needed on the 2014 Act, but some of the work done by Sheffield Hallam University, ASB Help, Remedy, I think has gone some way to addressing that question. Miranda, could you just go to the next slide for us, please? Just some initial observations around respect orders from my perspective. And again, I view this from a practitioner's perspective. At the moment, there's more questions than answers. Obviously, the legislation is still working its way through Parliament, or the Act is. So certainly at a community safety level, colleagues and myself have more questions and answers to see what that looks like. Again, just probably going to my last point I made, do we need those additional powers? Additional powers are always helpful for us from a policing perspective to address new forms of ASB which have emerged. For example, e-bikes would be a really good example. But do we need those additional powers, or is the 2014 Act still fit for purpose? I suppose some concerns for myself is that obviously we, as I previously mentioned, around data returns, will there be an arms race to reach out for using respect orders? Obviously from an ASBO perspective, for people who have long memories, they became at times a bit of a badge for honour, and we were issuing like confetti, and there wasn't really a really focused approach. I would hope we've matured our response towards that, but again, that would be a concern around that we issue them without any focus or proportionality around them. And again, through the information I've received from the government, again, there's very much an urban focus, and I've already made mention around where do rural communities feature in this. And it's just not about the police, but just not about the community safety networks. It's about a whole system approach. So what's it, for example, is the views of the courts? Are there services in place there when you put conditions, be it positive and negative, against individuals? Is the system able to support those new orders coming in place? The one thing I would say is, I think the subject matter is keeping ASB on the political and operational agenda, which I think is a force for good from my perspective as a thematic lead. So those are just some initial observations on respect orders. I'm very, very conscious of time. So Miranda, could you just go to my final slide, please? Thank you. I talked about I'm not an academic, but I'm hoping to return to an academic environment very, very shortly. I don't want to just be viewed as a pundit. I want to make a contribution to research in the SB field. So I have put together a proposed PhD research, which I've submitted to a local academic institution. And again, it's just around evaluating how we are using, in this case, closure powers. There is very little research on how we are using closure powers effectively, be it at the notice or order stage. So hopefully, if accepted, my PhD proposal will close that gap over a period of time, looking at legislative policy adherence, but also subsequent enforcement and evaluation. And I think my time is done there, Phil.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Very well timed and really, really useful. And you do not need to, I should have said this at the start, need to apologise for not being an academic. That is really not something, but I do hope you're all well with your PhD. And yeah, part of the point, as I said at the start of these seminars, is to bring together people with frontline experience, academics, policymakers, people from different perspectives. And I think the panel speaks to that. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Andrea to get a different view, I assume, or certainly a different perspective on ASB powers and how they've been used in the past, and where we might go to with respect orders. So over to you, Andrea.
Sorry, just working out how to unmute myself. Not normally a problem. Shutting me up is normally the issue. But thank you so much for the opportunity to come and engage in this discussion. I have to say, it's very surreal as a child of the 1990s, very much growing up in the ASBO generation, to be here talking about the return of the ASBO. Sounds like the name of a terrible film, and spoiler alert, one which I don't think is going to have a particularly happy ending. Jokes aside, though, when we're talking about respect orders and the novel powers they promise, I think it's very important to remember we're really not talking about anything new. Instead, we're talking about what, from Justice's perspective, the recycling and the rebranding of a mechanism that's been used and reused across the justice system to try and tackle problem behaviours, with often very poor results in practice for victims. This was one of the findings that arose out of our report that you mentioned at the start, Phil. That report examined the function and effectiveness of these types of powers. We worked alongside a range of stakeholders, including the police, including representatives from South Yorkshire Police, from local authorities, from youth justice experts, and from victims groups. And we found that ever since the ASBO, these types of orders have proliferated across the justice system. They now exist in relation to all different sorts of contexts, from protest to domestic abuse to knife crime. And of course, in relation to anti-social behaviour, we've got the community protection notices, public space protection orders, dispersal orders, anti-social behaviour injunctions, criminal behaviour orders. I'm going to refer to these collectively as orders. But these are all powers which are available to the police and local authorities now, and they're tools which are already capable of achieving everything that respect orders promise. Our report identified problems with the way that these powers or orders are currently being used, and we are concerned that the introduction of respect orders is not only not going to resolve any of these existing issues, but is going to exacerbate them further. To give you an example, we identified systemic issues, including ambiguities in legislation, lack of training, lack of funding for enforcement, and lack of sufficient monitoring within police forces and local authorities. These problems have led to inconsistent and sometimes the inappropriate use of these powers. Local authorities and the police we spoke to told us that the sheer volume of different tools available has caused confusion. It's not clear when to use an order, which order to use, and when to pursue the criminal route. It's led to a postcode lottery across the country, and it's problematic from the rule of law. Someone in one area of the country can have an order imposed on them for doing a behaviour that someone else in a different part of the country is either at liberty to pursue or is being criminalised via a criminal offence. Local authorities and police also explained that the test for imposing an order was not clear. For example, what amounts to a detrimental effect on the quality of life of those in the locality? Well, that looks very different for different people, including different officers. And that subjectivity has led again to inconsistent enforcement. It has also led, unfortunately, to orders being imposed in what I think most people would deem to be inappropriate circumstances, or at least in respect of behaviours which in and of themselves people would not deem harmful. For example, we came across cases where individuals had orders imposed on them for behaviour such as feeding the birds, advertising a charity bake sale, wearing a bikini in the garden. These might seem like extreme examples, but they're real examples from different areas of England and Wales. And the result is, if somebody goes ahead and does one of those behaviours, they will be convicted of a criminal offence, which will have long-lasting implications. using orders in this way is not just problematic from the point of view of those who are subject to them, but it's also problematic because it diverts very important resource away from where the focus should be on tackling the real issues and actors that are causing harm to our communities. The inappropriate use of orders came up a lot in the context of those experiencing homelessness. John referred to work done by Vicky Heap at Sheffield Hallam University. Part of Vicky's work also included reviewing the impact that these types of orders have on those experiencing homelessness. And what's very noticeable is that those experiencing homelessness not only are more likely to be victims of antisocial behaviour than perpetrators, but are significantly more likely to have these types of orders imposed on them and be impacted by these types of orders than other members of the community. And we also heard of these orders being used due to the lack of appropriate infrastructure and funding to conduct rigorous investigations, being used by perpetrators of antisocial behaviour to victimise victims of antisocial behaviour and used in a retaliatory type of action. We found that inadequate procedural safeguards in the investigation and enforcement of orders gave rise to significant risk that these orders were being imposed on individuals who were experiencing vulnerabilities by reason of intellectual disability, mental ill health. Those who were experiencing substance use disorders were far more likely to have an order imposed on them, were far more likely to breach an order because sufficient support was not available to them to comply with the conditions in the order. Many of the conditions in the order actually were as a detriment to their ongoing treatment. For example, we heard of individuals who were excluded from the town centre, meaning they couldn't access food banks, they couldn't access or go to their drug rehabilitative problem. And ultimately, there wasn't enough support or holistic thinking from a public health or safeguarding approach to understand how to support those individuals. This was particularly problematic in the context of those who have autism or ADHD. We found that they were actually being subject to enforcement measures due to behaviours that were intrinsically part of their being, rather than being anything to do with antisocial behaviour. Despite the government stressing that orders are preventative and rehabilitative, we also found that their practical effect means that they're unduly punitive. So, for example, there's a lack of funding for available services and programmes, means that even when local authorities and the police want to divert people to therapeutic programmes and educational courses, there's simply no money in the public purse to allow them to do so. And that's a big problem with respect orders, because we keep hearing about them being rehabilitative, but it's very difficult to see how they possibly will be. I have to say that it's worth mentioning that no local authority or police officer we spoke to as part of our work endorsed the use of orders in this way. They were very clear that the problems that I'm talking about were very much consequences of inadequate funding, inadequate resource, inadequate support. And the good news there is that there are solutions. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There's many solutions to address many of the problems I've just mentioned, but tellingly, not one of those solutions involves creating a new order. I was at a national conference before Christmas with around 80 representatives from social housing, community mentor groups, local authority officers, police officers. I asked a question whether any of them wanted to see respect orders. The answer was unanimous, no. They didn't see how they were going to help or add anything to the existing toolkit. In fact, they might make things worse, which is absolutely Justice's position. But there are solutions, and just to summarise them quickly, what we would really like to see is the government commit to undertaking a review of the existing 2014 Act measures, to work with people like John from the police to understand how what a successful multi-agency working on ASB really looks like, to understand what resources are needed, how to better fund local authorities. We've seen some damning reports this week about the sheer cost to youth services, to mental health support, to access to food security, housing security. All of those types of issues we want to see addressed, and we want to see police and local authorities not given more powers, but given more resources to use the existing powers in a way that not only protect victims, but also prevent further harm to those who are subject to orders, when really, in fact, those individuals would benefit from a safeguarding approach.
Awesome. Also, well done for keeping almost precisely to 10 minutes. So that is fantastic. And finishing in a really useful place of thinking about solutions, which kind of brings us very neatly to Anna Coffey's presentation about thinking about ways to solve the problem of ASB from, I think, will hopefully be a sort of a unique perspective for a number of us listening. So over to you, Anna.
Lovely, thank you. And I think, Miranda, do you have my slides as well? Perfect. So to start off, I'm going to really quickly whiz you through kind of the organisation I work with and what we do, partly to explain my perspective and where I'm coming from, and partly as a disclaimer, because I am in no way an expert on the criminal justice system or respect orders. So High Trees is based in Lambeth. We are a community development trust. Could you skip forward, Miranda? We're a community development trust. We work with about 1,700-ish service users each year, and we've got a range of services. So we've got community education and training, employment and careers, children, young people and families, community action, community research, and we do a lot of sector support too. Our approach is unashamedly place-based, which means we are an organisation set up by residents in the local area and predominantly serve the residents on our doorstep, which is why we provide the range of support that we do. Most relevant here, perhaps, is our children, young people and families service. If you skip forward, Miranda, which is based at Tulsa Adventure Playground. And the services we offer are probably quite old school in some ways. It is after school and summer holidays, adventure play provision. That's at the heart of everything we do. It gives children and young people a chance to have a green space on their doorstep and explore, play in a safe environment. Alongside that, we've got mentoring, so that's kind of one-on-one or group work in schools and on the site. And we do a lot of work around kind of youth voice and youth leadership. And in a nutshell, that's what we do, and that's our approach to working with children and young people. It is all on the basis of early intervention. It's all on the basis of giving children and young people an experience to play and to thrive and to enjoy their childhood. And the aim is that a wonderful side effect of that will be to give people the opportunity to stay on a path and avoid behaviours such as antisocial behaviour and lack of employment and kind of all the other problems that can occur past that. Those aren't the reasons we do the work. The reasons we do the work are kind of for positive reasons, and then that hopefully is one of the outcomes. If you skip forward, Miranda. So a key part of our work is that everything we do is delivered in partnership with other organisations. No one organisation can be the solution for everyone and for everything. No one organisation is a specialist in everything. And even within the children and young people we work with, we might be the solution and a wonderful provision 90% of the time. They might need some sort of other specialist intervention 10% of the time. We have set up a number of partnerships across Lambeth, working with others in the sector. So one of them is Building on Brixton. That's a network of 10 youth organisations focused around the central Brixton wards. And we're a combination of place-based organisations, so providing services on the doorstep, and then more specialist interventions that we can refer young people in and out of. And kind of the idea is that every young person, whatever organisation you approach, whoever you find us, you then can be seamlessly referred into this network of organisations that can meet different young people's needs and can do that at different times in their lives. Another partnership we've set up is the Lambeth Peer Action Collective, which is a kind of community research focused group of young people and the youth organisations that support them that at the moment are particularly looking into violence as it affects young people and the protective factors around that. We lead some other partnerships too, but those are kind of more youth focused work. So that's just giving a bit of context in kind of my interest in this area. And again, a bit of a disclaimer of the things I'm definitely not an expert in, but I've been asked to kind of consider respect orders in the context of the work we do and our approach to working with young people. And I think if we can go next slide, Miranda. So I'll be very, very honest. I mean, obviously, respect orders were vaguely on my radar, and I'd see them in the manifesto and read a couple of articles about them, but hadn't paid too much attention. But when this came forward, I did my very best to work out what they were and therefore what I thought of them. And I think, as referenced already, my immediate impression was it's the ASBOs again. And again, I think this is probably purely my age. But in my head, ASBOs are intrinsically linked to the opening sequence of Byker Grove. And as far as I could make out, that's the sort of behaviour they were aiming to tackle. Context is everything in terms of what sort of behaviour is trying to be tackled here. So I did my best to have a look at what they are, what we think they are, what sort of behaviour they're trying to tackle. And I just couldn't immediately find relevance to the sort of work we do, the sort of young people we work with, the sort of behaviours we're trying to steer young people away from. I honestly did my very best. So I went and read the Hansard, which is, you know, the kind of to have a look at what sort of behaviours are being named, what the debate around it was. And as far as I could work out, there were obviously everyone takes turns to name check their constituency and then say a particular problem that they think this might try and tackle. And again, not a legal expert, but as far as I could work out, everything they were naming with respect orders in mind seemed like crimes already to me. So every time they named something that hopefully this would tackle, they just sounded like crimes. So given from our perspective, and obviously I'm absolutely stepping a bit over into my personal opinion here, the police are undoubtedly really, really under-resourced, undoubtedly trying to do an incredibly difficult job in difficult circumstances. But it doesn't seem to me that they're enforcing the law as it is currently or tackling things that are happening that the criminal law's already set up to try and tackle. So I was just left kind of vaguely baffled by the whole thing and why they were necessary and what they were supposed to tackle. In our really particular context, our adventure playground is based on Tulsa Estate, which I don't expect anyone to know, but it's basically much like lots of Lambeth, a huge densely populated area of social housing. And the young people and their families effectively housing, the recreational areas, the service, it's all really densely concentrated. So people live, work, access services very, very much on their doorstep. And actually, in terms of the services we offer, that's a positive thing. We want to be on people's doorstep. So firstly, the children we're working with, they're not hanging out on the streets kind of throwing stones at people, which like, well, that sounds terrible. Obviously that needs to be stopped and they need to be dispersed. I can't really think through what extra thing would be banned or how that would help the young people or how that would steer them away from some of the really, really damaging behaviour that they are vulnerable to getting involved in. Don't want to be overly negative, like effectively, if part of this is supposed to be sticking some sort of referral order alongside kind of pre-criminal sanction or potential criminal sanction, yes, if we've reached the stage that young people or kind of older young people are very much at risk of engaging in criminality or already or within the criminal justice system, then absolutely there is a space for specialist services, properly resourced, to step alongside them at that point and try and steer them away. And kind of some of the organisations we work with in our partnerships, that's absolutely what they specialise in. They'll pick up the young person at that stage, work with them really intensively, and then try and cascade them back into kind of different, more generalist services. I think I am next slide now, Miranda. Okay. So what are alternative approaches to this as far as we're concerned? I think the key point is that by the time you've reached this level, it's already a massive failure. If you are picking up young people or older young people at the point where this is even a question, we failed them, and we failed them in multiple ways already. The more fundamental question is, how do we prevent this sort of behaviour occurring in the first place? That it's not complicated, but it requires a massive amount of resource. In our opinion, it requires kind of a partnership approach, not just the sort of partnerships we're engaged in, but kind of a true partnership approach between schools, between social services, between the criminal justice system, between organisations like ours. All the evidence and just common sense tells us that if you invest in that, and if you invest in that early on, it not only produces better outcomes for people, but of course is actually cheaper in the long run, because by the time you're stepping into kind of the criminal justice world, everything becomes harder and a lot more expensive to resource. There are good examples. So there are good examples of this sort of partnership working being done. I think I'm next slide now, Miranda. For all the things our local authority does well and badly, their approach to kind of their early help offer is something that's really valuable. And that absolutely is hopefully probably not too many steps before you're talking about kind of on the edge of, but before, you know, the earlier you can identify a child who does need more specialist support or more complex support, having an early help offer, so the opportunity to kind of refer them in, and the referral organisation alongside the council, alongside social services, alongside the school, alongside any other organisation that's seen as being able to offer support, kind of really coming around that child and trying to intervene at that point, has seen some really, really positive outcomes. And I suppose that's my summary, that I can't really see how respect orders are going to be helpful or are that applicable to the environment we're working in. I don't want to be hostile for no reason, but I don't really understand it. There absolutely is a solution, and the solution is expensive and less flashy, and takes a lot more time and a lot more resource, and it really is focused on preventing it 3 steps before we're even having this conversation. I think that's
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I'm getting some echo. Sorry about that. That was really, really, really great insight into sort of how we could do things differently. And I guess that's where I'm going to just start the Q&A. And by all means, I know some people have already started asking questions in the Q&A, but please do send them flooding in. But I guess one question I sort of thought was, if you were Home Secretary for a day and you were charged with reducing antisocial behaviour, what would you choose to do? Would it be respect orders? Would it be something else? So I kind of wanted to put that question maybe to John and Andrea first, because I think Anna's already sort of answered it. But John, if all the august powers of the Home Secretary, but you only had one day and one choice to make to reduce ASB, what would you pick?
As I previously cited in the presentation, Phil, I think that the ASB patrols were a great example of, and I used the methodology around time, resources, focus, but also the expectation is you're not going to achieve results to make a difference in the short term. It's been very much a program over 2 years. So I suppose my plea would be, we need additionality of funds and resources and time and breathing space to make effective changes to ASB. And I still think there's a requirement to use the existing powers at the moment and to allow them to mature, or otherwise to test them. And I don't think that testing is naturally, there's been pockets of work taking place, Andrea mentioning Vicky's work and others. I still think that act, which I think is a very good act, it still allows time to mature, or even though it's been in place now 10 plus years.
Yeah. So I mean that it sounds like there's a certain amount of consensus that there should be sort of a review of what we've currently got, and I think there's also sounds like there's a bit of a consensus about these problems can't be legislated away, They require partnership working. They require, as Anna said, early intervention and prevention before this even becomes a problem. And obviously this government has announced, or has at least committed itself to, things like youth prevention partnerships. I'm a member of the Youth Justice Board. We're still trying to work out exactly what that is and how that fits within existing local partnerships. They've also talked about things like youth future hubs, which sound like they're place-based things for either children at risk or and again, we're not entirely sure exactly what they mean by that. And I don't know if the work that Anna's described sounds a lot like what a youth future hub, as far as I can tell from what they've announced, should be. But again, we're sort of feel still like early days. And I guess it sounds like early days, but there's this commitment to do some legislation for a new power. I'm going to move. Actually, I'm going to ask Andrew that same question, and then I'm going to move to some of the stuff in the Q&A. So sorry, Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So the first thing I would say is look and listen. And what I mean by look is there's never been a comprehensive review of the existing measures under the 2014 Act. When we had ASBOs, the government were forced to collect data centrally and publish that data centrally. They stopped doing it midway through the ASBOs. Under the 2014 Act, we don't have that data either, which means we don't really understand how they're being used, who they're being used against, how many times they're breached, whether they're effective, what types of conditions within them help, which ones don't help. So until such time as you have that evidence, how on earth are you going to make new policy until you know what works and doesn't work? One other, just to really show how easy it could be to resolve some of these things, I want to give one quick example of a situation that arose in one local authority area. They had a problem with children who were hanging around in multi-storey car parks in the dark, and they were on their bikes and electronic scooters. Individuals, members of the public, felt intimidated by this. It was causing road traffic issues. The local authority went to those representatives of the local children's group. The children were clear. We want somewhere to hang out and do tricks on our bikes and scooters. You've just closed the local park, which had the skate park in it. Can we please get that reopened, or can you give us some programs to learn how to do tricks on our bikes? Unfortunately, the response was there's no money to do that. So instead, they all got issued with CPNs. And a PSBO got created, which causes more problem for the police and local authorities having to enforce them. The solutions are there. They're not. You don't need to be a genius to work out what they are. We just need better funding.
There you go. There you go, Home Secretary. Anna, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I don't want to get us off track, but I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't chip in and say we are, as a sector, so kind of as a local sector in Lambeth, incredibly worried about youth hubs. We don't consider that a place-based approach. We consider that as, if handled incorrectly, a threat to the place-based approaches that we've built up. We don't mean a super youth centre in Lambeth Centre. By place-based, we mean on your local housing estate. And it's a whole other conversation, but there are lots of reasons why we think that's the solution.
It's really useful. I'll take that back to the Youth Justice Board. We are equally actively engaging as to what that all means at the moment. It's very much being driven at the Home Office level at the moment. I'm just going to move to some of the questions, and actually because Sharon McLaughlin has put a number of things in the chat. I think some of those questions have been answered, but I'm also just going to voice not a question, just a response to Anna. So I think I'm right in saying that Sharon works for Resolve. So as a collective working to tackle ASB, we need to share more data around who are the perpetrators of ASB. In my view, the majority of the general public perceive young people as the main perpetrators, when indeed they're more likely to be the silent victim who go on to be fouled by the very agency who should be keeping them safe, which I think is a comment that's kind of stands on its own. Moving to Karen Harrison's question. So, and this was raised a bit by Andrea of the ASBO generation that I unfortunately am part of, just showing my age as well. how are we going to ensure that any new orders aren't being used to either criminalise children, though I think actually the government, to be fair to them, have said they're not going to use these for children, but how do we make sure that the new respect orders aren't used as badges of honour in the way that certainly some evidence suggested that some people saw ASBOs as? So I just sort of throw that open to the panel. John?
So from the outset, I would hope there is proper governance in place, that the courts have a key role to play in this. And I agree with Andrea that even within South Yorkshire, sometimes there can be discrepancy around the courts and what orders are applied. So my starting point would be there would have to be good governance arrangements in place to monitor their use, their application, and their process. I think that would be a good starting point, and a selective use of the tool. And again, I am of that age, Phil, even though I don't show it, of that ASBO generation, and that is where I've got some key concerns. But I think if we've got proper governance in place, that should be one methodology of trying to prevent us going down that track.
And while you're responding to that, I think one question that's in the chat is the evidence behind. Is there evidence behind the recruitment and deployment of more police officers and reducing ASB? And you mentioned in your presentation problem-oriented policing and SARA. I just wondered if you wanted to spend a bit more time on. It might not be about how to effectively use policing resources to tackle ASB.
Yeah, I always think problem-oriented policing is actually wrongly named. It should be problem-oriented partnerships. And I think that's the fundamental key to problem solving. And I think Anna made reference to it, that it's not just one department, one organisation who provides a solution. It should be that multi-agency approach. And I think that's the key, adopting a POP approach, that those plans reflect that multi-agency response, be it direct youth intervention, the use of the local authority, who have their own separate powers to the police. So that the key ingredients, I think, is that partnership, stakeholder approach, but also involving the community as well. You know, we often forget, and I'm very guilty of myself, is that actually what do the community want? What do victims want? And they should be that first stage of consultation around designing out issues in particular locations, because at some stage the police, the local authority, they will withdraw, and the key success around POP is are we able to sustain that, and how do we measure it? And again, that's why we've got multiple plans in place to try to go for that methodology.
And I mean, one of the things that's obviously a constraint for the government is often the answer to a lot of questions that they're being posed by civil society and others is we need more funding, and there is a certain amount of funding going into policing. It may not feel like that. It would be interesting to know if it does feel like that. But I guess one question that's sort of linked in a number of the questions in the Q&A is sort of, if there is additional money, where best does it go? And you mentioned partnerships, and I think someone in the chat's mentioned sort of the reduction in the availability of mental health treatment, drug resources, etc. Reduction in the ability to tackle things like homelessness. I wonder if anyone on the panel has a sort of sense of where they see the kind of key strategic priorities are for additional funding, if there is any. Andrea, you're nodding, so I'm hoping you've got a cogent answer to that.
Yes, well, firstly, I think it's most important that individuals closer to the ground than our organisation is answered that question. So I'm sure John Nana will have much more kind of focused ideas than I do. But in the context of discussing finances, I think it's also worth pointing out that the use of these orders, the true cost of these orders, it's never been costed. And until such time as we can work out, well, how much does it cost to impose an order, get it to court, appeal it, enforce it, get access to programs, then it's a hard starting off point to work out how much more funding, whether the funding we're asking for is proportionate or not. So I think that needs to be taken into account. In terms of where funding should be placed, one thing that Justice recommended in our report is very much along the lines of creating multi-agency partnerships between the police, local authorities, public health, to be and youth justice experts and local community leads, to be in a position to assess what is already there within the community, what resources do we have that we can utilise, and how we can improve decision making between all of those experts. And I would like to be able to see funding going into setting up those kind of holistic multi-agency partnerships, which straight away, almost immediately, allows there to be more discussion about when orders should be used appropriately and how to redirect people on to support that already exists within the community.
Very helpful. One of the questions in the chat, which sort of speaks to something that you mentioned, John, about seeing ASB in rural communities. So often, as we heard from Anna, in high density places, having physical place-based work can be really important. How does that work in how have you seen it work in more rural places where maybe a place-based thing is not the answer to giving people a place to go to for positive activities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing I think firstly, we have to reach out to those communities. So we have to have a methodology of engaging with those with such communities, and things like Rural Farm Watch. We have our own rural crime team here in South Yorkshire, who develop that network of contacts with farmers, local retailers, and from that you tend to get a much more of a volunteering network as well through that Farm Watch program. So I think the challenge for us is to actually go out into these communities, and the challenge will be that obviously, our stations tend to be typically urban based, but I think if you've got an effective neighbourhood policing model, I certainly had a large rural community, and if you've got place-based teams within those localities, there is options and methodologies. Social media would be a really good example, where you can reach out to them and understand the challenges they have, the issues they are facing, and again, how you appropriately respond to that.
Excellent. I actually completely missed the fact that I've got about 30 seconds to wrap this all up. So that's my own fault for not thinking about my own time. So without further ado, I just wanted to thank in particular our speakers for today, Andrea, Anna and John. I think that was really fascinating. I think we actually sort of came, it's not always the case with these sessions, to some level of a relative consensus on certain things around how to tackle ASB. And that was really useful to hear. I will certainly pick Anna's brains in more detail about Youth Future Hubs, because that's definitely a perspective I'd like to hear more from. Just finally from us at the centre, so we do a lot of work in criminal justice and a lot of work in family justice, in particular in criminal justice around prevention and diversion. We have at various points done work on civil orders, so things like domestic abuse protection orders, which are being piloted now, and their precursors. I was involved in a review the Civil Justice Council did on ASB eyes. And we're about to publish some evaluations of the knife crime prevention orders, which is another civil order that had criminal implications. So we are growing our work to look at what Justice called, was it behavioural orders? Is that the right phrase, Andrew? Yeah. So watch this space if this is of interest to you. But yes, once again, thanks for those attending online. Thanks to my colleagues Miranda and James for putting it together. Thanks to our speakers, and I hope you all have a lovely day. As I said, we'll make this available on YouTube within hours, Miranda says. So there you go. Thank you very much, everyone.